Hello, so I am sat here with Professor Tim Burt, who is President of the FSC. Hello, Tim.
Good morning.
Would you like to share a little bit of an introduction about yourself, how you've kind of led to this point?
Yeah, well, I'm a retired Professor of Geography. I was first introduced to Slapton by a returning placement student who had the early nitrate data she wanted to look at. That was 1977. First came here in 1979 and brought my first field trip here in 1980. So I've been coming to Slapton for a long time.
Long time.
Quite a lot of my research has been based down here over the decades. I've been president of FSC since 2014, having been chairman for 18 years before that. So I'm an old FSC hand, I suppose.
You've been studying the Ley for now 5 decades at this point.
Yeah.
What do you think is the biggest change that you've seen in that time?
Well, I think in one sense, the reversal in the nitrate concentrations, and that they've begun to come down, having sort of risen very steadily through the 80s and 90s. So that's perhaps the biggest change. And I'm sort of perceptually, because I'm not the person to have the date, I think there is more of a problem of summer algal blooms than there used to be, although there always was an issue with that. But I think that may have got worse. So while we're seeing some improvements in water quality, we're not seeing improvements in other aspects.
So obviously the Ley is fed by multiple streams. What would be the effect of, say, one of those streams becoming polluted?
Well, I'm a bit worried about Blackalton sewage works at the moment, because you may know there's a lot of interest nationally on sewage spills, particularly those that happen in dry weather rather than when there's been rainfall. And I know for some data I saw just last week that Blackalton is not doing very well, a lot of overflows. And that's worrying, because that could be bringing pollution into the Ley more than we need. So I think we're always vulnerable to pollution in any of the influent streams, and that's always a risk.
How important is it to have such a long-standing record at Slapton Ley?
Oh, I think long records are really important for quite a number of reasons. We've got the water quality data, which tend to go from 1970, and they, long data sets allow you to, test hypotheses. They often spark new questions because things crop up in the data that are new and different. And sometimes there are rare events. I mean, something like the 1976 drought, is a rare event within a long record. So long records are really important for, for monitoring what's going on and raising new questions. We have weather data here from 1960. So we've got 60 years of climate data to go alongside all the hydrology and water quality data. And I was looking yesterday, and if you just put a linear regression through the 60 years of data, Slapton's warmer by more than 1 degree centigrade than it was in 1960s. Now 1 degree C doesn't sound very much within a sort of rather noisy record of seasons and different sorts of years, but 1 degree centigrade is a lot. We're trying to keep below 1.5, and Slapton in 62 years is already at 1.2. So it's important to have the long record, and it's important to worry about things that long records tell us. And just to finish off on that theme, 2022 was the 2nd warmest year on record at Slapton, and most of the warmest years are this century. So we're in a period of climate change, and that has implications for all sorts of things.
So in your opinion, what's the most tangible link between climate change and pollution levels? Unless you've got something that can link the two of them. Well,
I think no doubt the nitrogen cycle is operating a little more briskly in a warmer world. The other thing is that Slapton has got a bit wetter in the last 60 years, and that probably means more winter runoff in particular, and that means more nitrate probably coming through into the Ley, all other things being equal. But the fact that it's in a sense getting wetter, but the nitrate levels are falling, means that whatever's being done to limit nitrate pollution is having some benefit. So that's good. But yeah, we're dealing with a complex system where you've got to worry about the amount of water, the temperature, and other aspects.
I was going to say, I wonder if it might be worth talking about obviously land use and how it's not necessarily the nitrates that are being used now, because obviously there's now limited use. It's the wetter it is, the more of those historic nitrates become an issue.
Well, there's not much storage of nitrate in groundwater at Slapton. It's not as if we're on the chalk where there's deep groundwater, but there's still a bit of a legacy. And of course there's a legacy in soils. And just because the nitrate concentration or the nitrate fertiliser applications are coming down, you're still getting leaching from quite rich soils. So it does take, these things will take time to settle down.
Beyond prevention, what is kind of the most applicable thing that we can do now to limit freshwater pollution?
Well, it depends how radical we want to be, I think. We could be very radical, and some people have suggested dredging the higher Ley and putting that sediment out to sea where it was going anyway, and so that the higher Ley comes back as a sort of buffer for the lower Ley. And if you think that's too much interference with nature, then you've got to think about other things. So it's probably, it's good that the nitrate application rates are coming down. We perhaps need more buffer zones in the catchment so that water has a chance to interact with sort of wet soils where the nitrate can be taken up before it gets into streams. So, maybe something like buffer zones would be a good idea. The big legacy that we've got is that in terms of phosphorus pollution, which may be driving in some respects the algal blooms, there's a lot of phosphate bound to sediment in the Ley, and so there's going to be quite a long period when that phosphate comes back into solution and keeps driving the pollution. That's not the only issue, because I think the reason we get these blue-green algae is because the whole eutrophication in the Ley means that the nitrate levels fall in summer, which sounds as if it's good, but that then encourages blue-green algae because they can fix the nitrogen themselves. So it's a complex system, even though it seems, we're just dealing with the Slapton catchments and one lake. It's still a pretty complicated system, even before you start worrying about, fish and plants and, eels and so on.
And I start worrying about my dog with blue-green algae, of course.
So you should.
Very toxic.
Yeah.
Quite a few people don't understand actually how bad the algae is. I see dogs off the leads all the time.
Yeah. Well, and it's why farmers can't graze their cattle on the Ley anymore, because it's just too dangerous. At least in summer, probably all right in the winter, but certainly not in the height of summer.
How great is the impact of the local land use, most likely farming, on Slapton Ley?
Oh, I think it's big, and I think we've recognised that for many decades. I mean, there were land use surveys being done as early as the early 70s. A Plymouth student, Penny Johns, who's now a professor at Bristol, she did her undergraduate dissertation here looking at land use and a very simple export coefficient model, and that sort of got us more and more interested in land use. I think the thing we've slightly underestimated over the years, and it brings us back to sewage and sewage works and so on, is that we've perhaps not worried enough about people and septic tanks and sewage overflow and so on. At least the Slapton sewage works doesn't any longer discharge into the lower Ley. It used to, but I think the phosphate stripper and the diversion drainage must have been there for a couple of decades now. But I don't think the same controls have been done at Black Alton, and maybe our next campaign is with South West Water to look at that particular works and say, come on, this isn't good enough. You've got a national nature reserve down the road, and we need to look after it better.
I think you might be able to tell me about this. I heard somewhere along the grapevine that there was a brand that still exists, kind of an eco brand, that actually before the sewage works were put in place, they supplied the whole of Tor Cross with phosphate-free laundry detergent. This might just be a rumour, this is just me questioning now. Ecover. Yeah, so they supplied everyone with phosphate-free detergent, is what I've heard.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. It would be a nice line to take and a good thing to do. And it's, you know, again, perhaps we need more of a campaign in the catchment area to say, you know, are you using more, you know, phosphate-based sort of detergents and so on than you need to. So I'm sure EcoVer is still around. So,
oh yeah, it's definitely still there.
Yeah.
Would you say that's one of the things that people could do to make small changes about, you know, limiting phosphates that enter the water system?
Yes, I'm sure so. And those, you know, every little helps.
Annual repeated algal blooms obviously raise the pH of the Ley in the summer.
Yeah.
How does this affect the Ley for the rest of the year?
I don't think it has a huge impact through the sort of winter half of the year, because once you've got more runoff, you've got more flow coming into the Ley, you've got more turnover in the volume of the water, so the input compared to the storage is much greater, and and that brings the pH back down, and I suspect doesn't have a huge impact. Having said that, I don't know what impact we would get, you know, interactions between the high pH and the phosphate in the sediment and that sort of thing. And it's probably an area, it's not really my area of expertise, but it's where we need people with the right skills to be working on, you know, the sediment water interface and looking at the nutrient cycling through the annual cycle. So we understand more about these things. It's, you know, the more researchers we can get at Slapton, everything from, you know, undergraduate dissertations through masters and PhDs through to sort of big research grants and so on. You know, the more the better.
I can hear the applications being written as we speak.
Yeah, well, it's a bit late for me now, but there are other people whose arms we should be twisting, and we do sort of try and get people like that interested and drag them along to the annual research seminar and you know, get them to take an interest, and sometimes they bite and sometimes they don't.
Are there any other sites that you wish you had studied or could have studied that have this historic data like Slapton Ley?
I don't know. I in a way, I think I've been lucky enough to study a number of sites with long water quality records, long weather records and so on. I'd never worked in the Norfolk Broads, for example. That would be an interesting analogy with Slapton Ley. Nor have I ever really done any work at Malham Tarn, which is a completely different sort of environment, but still one with, you know, with pressures of you know, some the same, some different. But no, I've been pretty lucky. I've studied, you know, sites which have tend to have long records. Some in the United States, Coweta in particular, which was set up in the 30s, so nice long records there of land use change and deforestation and so on and so forth. But I'm not sort of discontented with having been interested in Slapton since 1977. So Julia Duckworth's influence was more important than she might have realised at the time. But,
I wonder do you know if Julia's still aware of how
she lives near Sidmouth, so she's not far away. I haven't seen her recently, but except on Facebook.
What is the coolest thing that you have observed at Slapton Ley, be it wildlife, any weather?
One of the funniest things I remember was we had a visitor, a physical geographer from Israel who came, and the late Steve Truggill and I brought him down to Slapton and took him. We used to have rowing boats, we could go out all the time, and while we were out on the Ley looking around at, you know, this and that, an RAF jet came by at a very low level and flew straight up the Ley, and we all sort of went, wow, and the guy from Israel said, our jets go much faster than that. So it's not really a story about hydrology, but we were showing round quite an eminent geomorphologist at the time, so it was quite fun to, you know, get his response. But yeah, we can't. I I don't know whether people do occasionally still go out onto the Lea for scientific purposes, but I know that fishermen and students don't do that any longer.
So this might be a bit of a plug, we actually have, when we get the DOV and the John Muir, it's the only time that any students can get onto the Lea, and they go out there to do some conservation work as part of their Gold Award.
Mm-hmm.
So
Good
they
for
went
them.
out
Good for them.
this year. What limitations are there to scaling up the data that you've got at Slapton Ley to a wider catchment area, say the UK?
Well, Slapton is, I suppose, quite typical of the sort of, Devon environment, if you like, Devon and Cornwall. It's maybe, there are differences elsewhere in terms of, lithology and, the depth of groundwater and so on and so forth. But there's still things we learned from Slapton that are applicable, particularly, land use change and sort of prevention of, with something like, say, buffer zones or, the timing and the amount of fertiliser input and so on. So there are lessons that you can spread across, and then in other places you just have to accept that, well, the world's a bit different if you're up on the chalk downs, and maybe, the patterns are not quite the same. But if we were to sit here and look at the water quality record on the River Thames, which dates back to the 1860s, longest in the world really. But you could look at the Thames record, and you could look at the Slapton record, and you'd say, oh yeah, I can see, there's some similarities there, even though the Thames is huge and quite varied in lithology. But so we've learned a lot from Slapton, even though it's only 50 square kilometre catchment, and but it's important, and it also, and we've learned partly because we've got a very important nature reserve that needs looking after. But as I said earlier, it's getting enough people to keep using Slapton as a research site. It may be small, but it's still important.
How can people get involved? So obviously you can volunteer and do water quality testing. How can people do that?
Well, that's quite important, I think, because COVID caused a bit of a break in the stream water sampling, which is a shame, but there it is. I think we've still got a bit of Environment Agency data and some odds and ends of Slapton samples, but the fact that the water quality sampling is getting going again, and that's being driven by volunteers and citizen science, that's a really good thing, I think, and that's meaning that we can get back to something like the sampling frequency we used to have, which is weekly, and we're still lucky enough that I'm able to persuade Durham University to keep analysing the samples for us, and there's a bit of a deal. I keep running the weather station if they keep doing the water samples, so perhaps we shouldn't publicise that too much. But anyway, they may not be watching the video, but anyway, that's what we do, and it's important because it's in one sense only weekly samples, but weekly samples from 1970, so it's a long record, and it enables you to, even if changes are slow and subtle, and taking a long time to appear, the Slapton record is long enough for that to happen. So it's a really important record, and the fact that people are doing that is great, and the fact that John is still doing the weather station and doing the daily observations, that's important, and it's a really interesting record, and one I hope to make more use of. If my next book is about weather and climate in southwest England, I think Slapton might be figuring quite prominently. It's obviously not the oldest records, but it's one site, and it's very good quality.
So for everyone else in the rest of the UK that might be watching, who maybe not be able to get to sort of here, maybe what could they do? So if they went to the Environment Agency, or if they went to Citizen Science, they could maybe even sign up and train as volunteer themselves for their own local stream.
Yeah, well, the place I would start would probably be their local Rivers Trust, because the local Rivers Trust will know what's going on. So down here, West Country Rivers Trust, and they, for example, have got a project in the River Colne, which is northeast of Exeter, and intensive agricultural catchment, not very good in terms of pollution. And we know it's got its own share of sewage overflows. And I do my bit once a month there and sample the stream that runs past Tiverton Parkway railway station and send it off, the results when I've done it, and it adds to the database. So I think that anybody who thinks, yeah, I could, I'd like to make my share, start with your local Rivers Trust and see if they can point you to a project, and I bet they can. And there are probably people who like to walk along beside these rivers, or maybe like to fish, or and so the state of the water is important, and
Is there anything else that you think people can do on a national scale to help with water quality, even if it's small changes?
Well, like we said earlier, I think everybody can worry about what contribution they make, and things that they do which perhaps they shouldn't do. Things that are down the loo which perhaps ought to be put out for proper landfill disposal or something like that. And but yeah, I like the idea of encouraging phosphate-free detergents. That seems to have disappeared a bit off the map. I don't know whether it's because detergent manufacturers have changed their their formula, but we all need to do our bit, I think, and just as we do with other aspects of climate change and so on, and being low carbon, and doing what we can to turn the lights off and walk rather than drive and so on.
I think that probably picked up quite a bit over COVID, didn't it? A lot more walking and a lot more public transport. Well, I suppose I use public transport probably less now because I live in Devon.
Yeah. Well, it's
but where I can, I walk.
Or cycle if you can, if it's not too far. But yeah.
Amazing. Is there anything else you would like to add?
No, I don't think so. I think we've picked up most of the things that we were going to say. For those who can see the books in the background, I would just say that Durham Weather and Climate, just since 1841, shows my ongoing interest, along with Stephen Burt, who's no relation, looking at very long weather records and why they're important. The other book, Curious About Nature, subtitle A Passion for Fieldwork, is full of stories by people who know the Field Studies Council, and just shows how important being out there doing field work, being curious about the natural world is important. And I know that's what FSC continues to do, which is to continue to encourage field work, to give people the opportunity to, bury their noses in a peat bog, or, a wetland, or even if it's just a bit of farmland, but to see things they perhaps haven't seen before. So I remain passionate about field work, which is why I'm still involved with FSC. So
thank you for that. I'm sure there's going to be lots of people watching this that would absolutely thoroughly enjoy to read your books, and hopefully we've got some people that might be interested in coming down to the Lea and doing some investigations, or even maybe in the rest of the country, looking into their local Rivers Trust. So thank you very much for that.
You're very welcome. Thank you.